Hey guys, Endless here, welcome back to the channel. This is part 6 for What If Deku is Cursed Speech. Also check out the videos on my playlist. But I hope you guys enjoy. As the duo waited for the rest of the participants to finish the obstacle race, Todoroki walked to the corner and glared at the two boys. He then clenched his fist. Shoto wanted to prove his father wrong. He wanted to show him that his mother's quirk wasn't as weak as he thought it out to be. After another 10 minutes of waiting, Midnight had spoke up, which ended up gathering everyone's attention onto her. Alright everyone, the first 42 applicants that finished the obstacle course will move on to the next round. She then continued, for those who didn't make it, go back to the stands, and continue to watch the festivities. After they heard this, the students that didn't make it to the next round had left the stage and made their way towards the stands. When Midnight was sure that only the 42 applicants remained, she had spoke up once again. Alright, for the rest of you, come stand in front of me. I will be announcing the next event shortly. The green-haired boy made his way towards the front with Yui at his side, with Katsuki walking behind the couple. Bakugo just chuckled as he followed. He was surprised that they just didn't care that a lot of people were looking at them. When Yui had finished the race, she had ran up to Izuku, and ever since then she hasn't left his side. Bakugo glanced at his side and noticed that Kirishima was walking alongside him towards the front. When Midnight saw that all of the remaining applicants were in front of her, she pressed the same button from earlier. Once she did, the same spin wheel had appeared at her side. Midnight spun said wheel and waited for it to land on something. Once it stopped spinning, she smirked at what it landed on. Cavalry Battle. Alright, the next event for the sports festival will be Cavalry Battle. This event works by a point system. Everyone has a set amount of points from the start, and this correlates with the placement you had on the obstacle race. For example, the 42nd participant has 10 points, and then the 41st has 20, and so on. As she was explaining, Katsuki looked at Izuku and spoke. So since we are at the top, we both will have 420 points, huh? The green-haired boy glanced at his friend and nodded. Salmon, tuna. The blonde just grunted and looked back towards Midnight. He heard her say something about being in a team of 4, there will be one rider and the other 3 will carry said rider. However, both of them noticed her not so subtle glance at them. Once she finished explaining, Midnight pointed at the two boys and spoke out loud. However, for the two people that got first place will each get 500,000 points each. As she said this, all of the applicants stared at the two boys, and Yui shrank a bit from all of the glares that were coming towards them. But when she looked at Izuku and Katsuki, the black-haired girl noticed that the two boys had a small smile. Yui wondered why they were smiling right now. Everyone will most likely go for them, so it will be hard to keep the points. However, that's when Katsuki turned over to the green-haired boy and spoke out loud for everyone to hear. So since we are probably not gonna be able to team up with anyone else, why don't we team up for this one and have our fight in the finals, he said with a big grin. Bakugo brought his fist up and placed it in front of the green-haired boy. After Izuku heard this, he just laughed and nodded. And not a second later, he brought up his own fist and the two had fist bumped. Both with similar grins on their face. They know that this is going to be difficult, but it will also be fun. However, once everyone in Class 1A had saw this, they gulped. Even Aizawa was surprised. He thought that the duo would just want to fight one another if the last round was anything to go by. But the teacher knew if they worked together they would be fine. After all, their teamwork is pretty destructive. When Yui had heard the blonde's declaration, she now knew why the duo were grinning like idiots. It's because they know together they can overpower all of the students here. Heck, they can both just be a two-man and still probably keep the 1 million points. But she spoke up and caught the blonde's attention. I'm joining Izu's team. Katsuki just gave her a thumbs up in reply and spoke. I wasn't going to exclude you from the team. He then turned to his side and spoke to the redhead next to him. Or you. He then continued, feel free to join the winning team if you want. Once said redhead heard this, he activated his quirk and pounded his fists together and replied. Yeah, I can make sure we don't fall. I will be the front horse, I won't let anyone pass me, he said confidently. After the blonde heard this, he just smirked. As the four were figuring out who was going to be their rider. The other students had chose their teams and were now waiting for midnight to say start. After the pro heroine noticed everyone was in teams, she coughed to get their attentions. Once everyone turned to her, she shouted towards the students. Alright, no intentionally knocking people off, that will be a disqualification. And you all will have 15 minutes and the top 4 teams will move on to the last event, so good luck. As she was speaking to the students, All Might stared at the 2 boys intently. The blonde hero knows he has to tell them both about his quirk soon, after all he knows who his successor is going to be. Midnight then continued. Alright everyone, spread out, don't be too close to the other teams. Once she had said that everyone had moved away from the other teams, however most of them were still close to the middle. Bakugo's team haven't moved, they were just waiting there. Why are they just waiting there? Shoto wondered. He then looked at the other 2 and saw how the black-haired girl looked a little nervous. And Kirishima just had a big grin on his face. It was like they are preparing for something, he analyzed. After he thought this, Todoroki heard Present Mix's booming voice. Let the second event of the sports festival begin. After all of the students heard this, they made a beeline towards Bakugo's team, who for their part was just standing there. However, once the students got closer, that's when the blonde shouted towards the green-haired boy. Do it now, Izuku. Once the green-haired boy heard the signal, he pulled down his scarf and jumped up. As he jumped, so did Yui and Kirishima. And once they were in the air, Izuku shouted. Foothold. When Bakugo knew the 3 below him were secured, he grinned and shouted. DIEE. And with that he launched an explosion towards the ground. But right as the blonde launched said explosions though, the green-haired boy had followed with his own attack. Expand, plus explode. Both of their attacks combined and boom! The ground below them was left in a massive crater, and once the green-haired boy saw this he nudged Kirishima. Said boy just nodded and activated his quirk while putting up his arms in a cross. As this was happening, all of the other teams were shocked. Mineta looked at the huge crater in the center of the arena. Then at Team Bakugo, who fell into said crater, with Kirishima taking the impact for them. The purple-haired boy just shook his head and said nope. His team just nodded in agreement. Back with Team Bakugo. The ash blonde shouted towards the other contestants. Come down and grab the 1,000,000 points from me. As the ash blonde was gloating anyone to try and attack them. Yui had grabbed a few rocks below her and started using her quirk as she threw them around the crater. When she was done, there was a clearing at the bottom of the crater with Bakugo's team right in the middle. However, if they want to attack them, the other teams have to go through the rock maze she had created. Bakugo and Izuku had came up with this plan so the rocks that were around them could buy them time. And when the teams make it through they would fight them, however there is another risk for them. If they try to go through the rocks and another team sneaks up on them, they can take their headband and make the other team have to try and get it back. So people tried to confront Team Bakugo, but some of them had lost their points as they were passing through the rocks, and so everyone stood clear from the crater. So this went on for another 13 minutes. And if you're wondering why aren't they collapsing the rocks, Izuku can just stop their movements before they crash onto his team. Then make a makeshift shield out of said rocks. Then Bakugo can just free them with his explosions. So basically they have to come face them head on, if they want the points, and the people that realized this paled. However, just as Bakugo thought no one was going to challenge them, he noticed some rocks up ahead getting covered by ice, then they shattered, making a straight path towards Katsuki. Said blonde looked up along with his team and saw Todoroki's team making their way down the crater. Then proceeded to cover the path that he had created with his ice, so no one else could interfere or join in. The green-haired boy watched as Shoto slid down the path towards them. then proceeded to launch ice at Bakugo. Once Izuku saw this, he shouted, "Blast away!" The two attacks then collided and the ice was shattered, but during that second when Todoroki's field of vision was blocked, Katsuki had launched himself in the air. Shoto glared at Izuku, then wondered, wait, where is Bakugo? He looked up and saw the blonde rushing towards them. Todoroki shouted Kaminari, and once the yellow-haired boy with a lightning bolt heard this, he shouts 1.3 million volts. As he launched his quirk, Momo had made sure Todoroki, Lita and herself wouldn't get hit by the lightning. However, as the lightning was racing towards Bakugo and his teammates, Katsuki had launched an explosion towards the side and dodged the lightning, moving like a blur as he did. And with the green-haired boy, Yui had threw a rock in front of them and quickly used her quirk on it, making it so the rock was hit instead of them. As this was happening, Izuku was drinking his cough syrup. Once that was done, he coughed for a bit, then looked towards Shoto's team and shouted, "Don't move!" After the blonde saw what Izuku did, he was about to launch himself down towards them, but a rock had shattered to his left. He then dodged what looked like vines. Katsuki blew some of them up and made it back to his team. However, as he landed, Present Mike had shouted, "Time is up." Everyone in the arena had stopped fighting and Bakugo landed onto the ground with a big grin. He looked at Shoto and said, "Nice try, half and half bastard." Shoto just looked away and walked to where Midnight had called the 4 teams that passed. Said teams that passed were Bakugo's team, Todoroki's team, Achiko's team, which consisted of Tokoyami, Tsuyu and Mei. Then the 4th team was Shinso's. The green-haired boy noticed that the people on his team just looked confused, like they don't remembered what happened. Izuku narrowed his eyes at the purple-haired boy, Bakugo had noticed this and was about to ask what was wrong. But that's when Midnight had spoke up to the 4 teams. "You 4 will be moving on to the one-on-one battles. It will start after the recreational games." She then looked at the crowd and shouted, "We will have a small break from the sports festival, so feel free to go grab something to eat or do whatever you want until it starts again." As Izuku was making his way towards the cafeteria with his girlfriend, he heard a shout at his side. Looking over, he saw All Might waving him over with Katsuki. The two quickly walked over to him and All Might spoke up. "You two want to join me for lunch?" he asked. Katsuki nodded, but Izuku seemed unsure. He wanted to be with Yui. Once Katsuki noticed that Izuku was about to shake his head no. Yui had shouted towards them, "It's okay Izu, I'm going to eat with Kendo." Izuku turned around and glanced at his girlfriend. Then he looked back towards All Might and Katsuki. The green-haired boy just shrugged and the duo followed after All Might, who was taking them to the teacher's lounge. Once they reached the lounge, All Might brought them to an empty room and walked inside of it. The two boys glanced at one another and walked in after him. Once they sat down in front of All Might, he handed them 2 bento boxes. Then after a few minutes of them eating the number 1 hero side, and said, "There's something I wish to share with the two of you." After he said those words, smoke had appeared around All Might, and once it disappeared there was a skeletal man in his place. Izuku and Katsuki both choked on their food as they saw this. And the number 1 just had a sweat drop with him, thinking, "Maybe I should have waited till they were done eating." He quickly handed the two a cup of water. Then after a minute the two were able to swallow their food. Katsuki coughed a bit and spoke. "So, is your quirk a transformation type?" The blonde questioned the other blonde. However, All Might just shook his head. "My quirk can't be classified by normal means." Both Izuku and Katsuki just looked confused at that response though. All Might, seeing this, just sighed and started to explain. "My quirk is called One for All. It's a quirk that can be passed down." Bakugo and Izuku's eyes went wide. They didn't think a quirk like that existed. After a minute Katsuki spoke hesitantly, "So why are you telling us this?" Izuku just nodded in agreement. "Mustard leaf? Because I wanted one of you to become my successor, but if Midoriya over there got my quirk, sure he would get a massive boost in power. But the drawback could be severe." After hearing this, the green-haired boy just nodded. He was fine with just having his own quirk. There is so much more he is able to do with it that he hasn't been able to do yet. and he wanted to figure it out as the green-haired boy thought this. All Might had spoke up and stared at Katsuki and asked bluntly. Do you want to be my successor? There is a great evil in this world and I'm not sure if I will be strong enough to defeat it, he said as he bowed his head. Katsuki was just stunned. He didn't know what to think about this situation. He glanced at his side and noticed Izuku giving him a thumbs up. Tuna. The blonde just smirked and responded, yeah, I will become your successor, All Might. After Toshinori heard this, he grinned and said, I will give it to you after the sports festival. Once they were done talking, the intercoms turned on and present mic could be heard. Izuku Midoriya and Fumikage Tokoyami come up to the fighting arena. When Katsuki and Izuku heard this, they got up and waved bye to All Might, who waved back and watched as the duo left the room. He thought, if I can't defeat All for one, those two boys will. Both boys had parted ways once they passed a corner. Katsuki went towards the Class 1 stands and Izuku made his way to the arena. The green-haired boy wanted to know why All Might told him about his secrets. But Izuku just shrugged and walked onto the stage. There he noticed Tokoyami standing at the other side. The green-haired boy then heard present Mike giving them both introductions. However, Izuku just chose to stretch during this time. And Tokoyami just stared at him with his arms crossed. Then Midnight appeared at the side of the arena on a slightly taller platform. You both will have to either push the other out of the arena, or when you are immobilized or unconscious. Are you two ready? When both boys nodded, she did a downward slash and shouted, Begin! After Tokoyami heard this, he called out, Dark Shadow. Said creature rushed towards Izuku, who muttered, Body enhancement, plus acceleration. With those words said, Izuku dashed towards Fumikage and left an after image in his place. Tokoyami, after seeing this, tries to call Dark Shadow back, but Izuku appeared in front of the boy and launched a kick to his face, which launched him towards the edge of the arena. He would have flown out, but Dark Shadow had used its claws to latch onto the stage. Izuku brought his leg down after he saw this and pulled his scarf down. Tokoyami noticed this and quickly sent Dark Shadow towards the green-haired boy again. Izuku had dodged to the side and shouted, Explode! Then once it landed onto Dark Shadow. Boom! It caused a small shockwave and the creature cried out in pain and went back to Fumikage. Izuku noticed this and smirked. So it's weak to my explosions, the green-haired boy thought. He then sweat dropped when he heard Katsuki shouting down towards him something about his explosions being stronger, but Izuku didn't hear him clearly due to the other people in the stadium who were cheering at the fight. Tokoyami stood up straight and tried to come up with a plan, but was coming up with blanks. He already knows Dark Shadow's weakness. There is no way he didn't notice how he reacted to that explosion. I didn't know he can do explosions like Bakugo though, and with that thought he launched Dark Shadow once again towards the green-haired boy. Said boy got into a stance and dodged Dark Shadow, then he dashed towards Tokoyami. Once Dark Shadow saw this, he tried to block his path, but Izuku just muttered, Explode! And quickly sent it to the ground. He then made it towards his opponent and threw a punch towards him. Tokoyami dodged said punch and tried to launch his own, but was quickly countered with an elbow to the side. He winced and jumped back. Unknown to the green-haired boy, Dark Shadow was slowly making his way towards Izuku, who for his part had noticed it when it was too late. Dark Shadow enlarged his arm and did a downward slash towards Izuku. The attack hit, but Izuku was able to counter. Blast away. So all he got was 3 scratch marks on his chest. Izuku looked down and noticed they weren't deep cuts. He then coughed a bit and some blood came out of his mouth. Tokoyami noticed this, but Dark Shadow was already retreating inside of him. Said boy just sighed and raised his left hand. I admit defeat, there isn't a way for me able to win. Midnight nodded and shouted, Izuku Midoriya is the winner. The green-haired boy gave a nod to Tokoyami and made his way towards his class. Tokoyami nodded back and left towards the stands. As the two left the arena, the crowd was now excited. That was a great first match. Sure, it was a fast match, but it was still great to watch, and it looked like the green-haired kid had an advantage over the other boy. When Izuku turned the corner he noticed Yui waiting for him by the staircase. She smiled once she saw him and ran over to him. And once she was in front of him the black-haired girl hugged him and gave him a kiss. She then broke it and said that was a good match Izuku. The green-haired boy just nodded and replied. Tuna, mustard leaf? He questioned. Yui giggled and replied, oh I had ran down here to greet you once they had called the match. She said with a small smile. Izuku just nodded and both of them made their way back to their class. But that is the end of this part. If you enjoyed this part let me know in the comments below. Also leave a like on the video.